The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Snow whipped across the ground in frenzied gusts, swirling in the dim glow of the streetlights. It was the kind of night where even the most desperate souls sought shelter, where the world outside was silent, suffocated beneath the weight of the storm. Daniel Carter had never been a fan of winter. The cold crept into his bones no matter how many layers he wore, and nights like this only reminded him of how empty his house had become over the years. He stood in his kitchen, waiting for the microwave to finish heating his dinner, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw as he listened to the wind battering against the windows. Then, 3 sharp knocks at the door. He frowned. No one came knocking at this hour, not in this part of the city, not in this weather. His neighbors weren't exactly the friendly type, and he had no family left who might come by unannounced. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but something about the way the sound echoed, hollow and urgent, made his gut tighten. Reluctantly, he made his way to the door and pulled it open, and the world seemed to stop. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The snow had piled high on the doorstep, and nestled within it was a small bundle of fabric. Something shifted inside, something alive, and then golden eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a quiet, pleading whimper. A baby, not human. Daniel's breath hitched as he took in the tiny, fragile form curled within the blankets. Its skin was a deep, dusky blue, its small fingers tipped with delicate claws. A faint luminescence clung to it, barely visible under the porch light, as if the child carried the last remnants of some dying starlight within its skin. His gaze lifted, and for the first time, he noticed the figure standing just beyond the porch, half hidden in the swirling snow. She was tall, easily taller than him, even with the way she hunched in exhaustion. Her long, black hair clung to her face, wet with melted snow, and her striking features were lined with something far deeper than just cold. Hunger, fear, desperation. She was Velmari, one of the alien refugees left stranded on Earth after the war. Daniel had heard about them. Everyone had. The war had ended years ago, but its wounds still bled. The Velmari had once been powerful, a race of scholars and warriors who had commanded the stars. But when war came, they had lost. Their homeworld was gone, burned to nothing. Their fleets were shattered, and the survivors? Scattered across human-controlled space, unwanted, abandoned, slowly fading into extinction. The baby let out another soft cry, and Daniel's eyes snapped back down. She had left it here, on his doorstep. His stomach twisted. Had she been turned away that many times? Had she knocked on so many doors, only to be met with cruelty, with silence? How many times had she begged for work, for food, for a place to sleep, only to be denied? And now she was out here, in the middle of a snowstorm, looking at him like he was her last hope. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. This wasn't his problem. He didn't know her. He didn't know her anything. The smart thing would be to close the door, pretend he hadn't seen anything, let someone else deal with it. But then the baby shifted in the blankets, its tiny hand curling into a fist against the cold. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. Before he could second-guess himself, he bent down and scooped the baby into his arms. It was so light, too light. The moment he held it close, it stilled, as if instinctively recognizing warmth, safety. When he looked up, the woman, the mother, was still standing there. She hadn't moved. She was shivering violently, her thin clothing soaked through, her golden eyes locked onto his face with a raw, unreadable expression. And then, slowly, her gaze flickered to the child in his arms. She thought he was going to take it inside and leave her out here. Daniel swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping back. Then, louder, "Get in here. Both of you." The woman flinched. For a long moment, she didn't move. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear. As if this was a trick, as if he would slam the door in her face the moment she took a step forward. But then she saw the way he was holding her child. Something in her expression shifted, and with slow, cautious steps, she crossed the threshold. Daniel shut the door behind her, sealing out the storm. She flinched again. It was subtle, but he caught it. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers twitched at her sides, as if preparing to defend herself. He could only imagine what she had been through. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice even. She didn't respond. She just stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Now that she was inside, he could see just how bad off she was. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollowed from hunger. The deep blue of her skin, which he knew from old news reports should have been rich and vibrant, was faded and dull. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. The baby made a soft noise against his chest, and Daniel instinctively shifted his grip, adjusting the tiny weight in his arms. It nuzzled against him, its breathing evening out. He sighed. "You hungry?" The woman inhaled sharply. He watched as her throat bobbed, her jaw tightening. There was a long pause, pride warring with survival. Then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." The house was warm, almost stifling compared to the icy world outside. The sudden change in temperature made the woman shudder as melted snow dripped from her clothes onto the wooden floor. Daniel noticed how her arms wrapped tightly around herself, fingers digging into the fabric of her tattered sleeves as if she were trying to hold herself together. He had seen exhaustion before, but this was something else, something deeper, more hollow. She stood frozen near the doorway, golden eyes darting between him and the baby still nestled against his chest. There was hesitation in her gaze, uncertainty. She didn't trust him yet. Daniel wasn't sure if he could blame her. "Come on," he said, keeping his voice even careful. He nodded toward the couch, the only piece of furniture in the small living room that looked remotely comfortable. "Sit. You need to get warm." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't move, but then, almost reluctantly, she stepped forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, and when she reached the couch, she sank onto it as if every ounce of her strength had been drained. Daniel exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his damp hair. He wasn't good at this, the whole comforting strangers thing. Hell, he wasn't even sure what he was supposed to do here. He had let her in, but now what? The baby stirred against him, letting out a soft whimper, and the sound seemed to snap the woman back to life. She sat up straighter, eyes locking onto the child with a sharp intensity. "She needs to eat," she whispered, voice raw with urgency. Her accent was light but unmistakable, the syllables softened in a way that was unique to the Velmari tongue. Daniel blinked, then nodded. "Yeah, you too." He turned toward the kitchen before she could argue, setting the baby down carefully in the bundle of blankets on the couch beside her. The little one made a small noise, but as soon as she felt the warmth of her mother nearby, she settled. The kitchen was a mess of half-used ingredients and dishes that Daniel had never been particularly good at keeping organized. He wasn't much of a cook. Most nights, dinner consisted of whatever he could throw together with minimal effort. But now wasn't the time for laziness. He reached for a can of soup, twisting off the lid before pouring it into a pot. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and more importantly, it was something he could make quickly. He set on the stove, turning the heat up high, then grabbed a half loaf of bread from the counter. It was a little stale, but it was food. It would have to do. When he turned back, he found the woman watching him from the couch. Her eyes flickered to the soup, then to the bread in his hands. There was no hiding the way her throat bobbed, the way her fingers curled against her lap, as if resisting the urge to reach out. "Not much," he admitted, setting everything down on the small table in front of her, "but it's warm." She hesitated for half a second. Then she reached forward, hands shaking as she tore off a piece of bread and brought it to her lips. The moment the food touched her tongue, something in her broke. She ate like a woman who hadn't seen a meal in days, maybe longer. Each bite was fast, desperate, her body too starved to care about anything other than filling the aching void in her stomach. Daniel didn't say anything. He just sat back in the chair across from her, letting her eat in silence. When the soup was gone, when the bread had been reduced to crumbs, her breathing was unsteady, not from exhaustion this time, but from something dangerously close to relief. Then, as if remembering why she had been so frantic in the first place, she turned to the bundle on the couch. The baby had begun to stir again, her tiny hands twitching, a soft cry bubbling up from her throat. The woman reached for her without hesitation, scooping her up into her arms, cradling her close. She murmured something in Velmari, a low, melodic sound, a language Daniel didn't understand but recognized instantly as something intimate, something ancient. Then she hesitated. Daniel saw it in the way her body tensed, the way her grip on the child tightened. Her golden eyes darted toward him, and for the first time since stepping into his home, she looked afraid. Not afraid of him, afraid of what she was about to do. Daniel frowned, about to ask what was wrong, but then he saw the way she shifted, the way she adjusted her hold on the child. And then he understood. She was going to feed her. Of course. It should have been obvious, but the moment realization set in, so did her discomfort. He could see it in the way her shoulders hunched, the way she turned slightly, as if trying to shield herself. Her kind were different, more reserved. He had read somewhere, back when the war was still fresh, back when humanity was still trying to understand the Velmari, that they treated certain acts with more delicacy, more reverence. This wasn't just nourishment. It was something sacred. And now she was in a stranger's home, with no privacy, no dignity left to protect. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He cleared his throat. I can give you a minute, if you want. The woman inhaled sharply. She hesitated, then gave a quick, barely perceptible nod. Daniel stood, making his way toward the hallway. He stopped just before rounding the corner and glanced back. She was already turning away, curling in on herself, the baby nestled securely against her chest. He saw the way she ducked her head, the way she closed her eyes. Not just from exhaustion, but from shame. And Daniel suddenly hated that she felt that way. He wanted to say something, to tell her it was fine, that she had no reason to feel embarrassed. But the words wouldn't come. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He gave her space. The house had never felt so full. For years, Daniel had lived alone, his days predictable, his nights quiet. He had built a life of solitude, not necessarily because he wanted to, but because it was easier. Easier to keep his head down, easier to avoid unnecessary complications. But now there was someone else here. Two someones, to be exact. The soft crackling of the radiator filled the room, the only sound accompanying the slow, steady breaths of the sleeping infant on the couch. The mother, Trey, sat across from him at the kitchen table, her golden eyes flickering between him and the warm bowl of soup in front of her. She had eaten once already, but it hadn't been enough. He could see it in the way she gripped the spoon, in the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly each time she brought it to her lips. She was still starving, still holding herself back, as if afraid this kindness might disappear at any moment. Daniel didn't rush her. He just sat there, watching the way her shoulders had begun to lose some of their tension, the way the color, though still faint, had started to return to her deep blue skin. She was exhausted, not just from hunger or cold, but from something heavier. He didn't need to ask to know that she had been carrying the weight of survival for far too long. You don't have to ration it, he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. Trey looked up sharply, as if she had forgotten he was there. His gaze dropped pointedly to the soup. Eat. There's more. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the spoon. Her expression was unreadable, but after a long pause, she nodded and took another bite, this time without the cautious restraint of someone expecting to be told to stop. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. Now that the immediate urgency had passed, the desperation of getting her inside, of getting food into her, of making sure the baby was safe, he was left with questions. She had said her name, but that was all he knew about her. He had no idea where she had come from, how long she had been out there, how many doors she had knocked on before she had ended up at his. She must have seen the questions in his eyes because she swallowed, setting the spoon down carefully before speaking. I try to find shelter, she said, voice soft, distant. For days. Her gaze dropped to the table, fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeves. No one opened their doors. Some turned me away before I could even ask. A pause. Then, quieter, some were not so kind. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. I went to a shelter, she continued. They said I had no space. I could see that it was a lie. Her voice was flat, almost resigned. They looked at me, at her. Her eyes flickered toward the sleeping infant on the couch, and they told me to leave. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wasn't naive. He knew how humans treated Velmari refugees. It wasn't open warfare anymore, not like before, but the hate hadn't gone away. It had just changed shape. Now, it was quieter, woven into laws and policies and looks of disgust. How long, he asked. How long have you been on the streets? She hesitated. Weeks, maybe more. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, something small but unmistakable. Time has blurred. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Weeks, in the middle of winter, with an infant. Jesus. His gaze drifted back to the baby. Ravi, he reminded himself. She was so small, so fragile. She stirred slightly in her sleep, one tiny hand curling into the fabric of the blanket. It was a miracle they had made it this far. Trey must have noticed the way he was looking at her child, because she exhaled softly. She is strong, she murmured, almost as if to reassure herself. Daniel nodded. She has to be. Silence settled between them again. This time, it wasn't quite as heavy. Trey took another slow bite of soup. The tension in her shoulders had eased. Not completely, but enough that she no longer looked like a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. After a while, she spoke again. You asked why I left her. Daniel met her gaze. I didn't. You were thinking it. She wasn't wrong. She swallowed, golden eyes darkening with something he couldn't quite name. I had no choice, she whispered. I hoped, if I left her somewhere safe, if someone kind found her, she would have a chance. She exhaled shakily, a better one than I could give her. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say to that. But you did not leave her, she continued, voice quiet but certain. You brought her inside, and you let me in, too. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I guess I did. She studied him, tilting her head slightly. Why? It was the same question she had asked before, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about trust, about intentions. Daniel sighed, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. Because you needed help, he said simply, and because no one else did. Trey didn't look away. For the first time since she had stepped into his home, she looked at him without suspicion, without fear. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it meant something. She finished the rest of her soup. When she was done, Daniel stood and walked toward the hallway. She tensed slightly, but he just disappeared into a closet, returning a moment later with a folded bundle of fabric. Here, he said, setting it on the chair beside her. They're clean. Might be a little big, but at least they're warm. She stared at the clothes for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached out, running her fingers over the fabric. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Daniel cleared his throat. There's a spare room down the hall. Nothing fancy, but it's better than the couch. You can use it. Trey inhaled sharply. She blinked, as if struggling to process the words. Then, finally, she nodded. Daniel grabbed the empty bowls and turned toward the sink. You should get some sleep, he said over his shoulder. You're safe here. When he glanced back, she was still looking at him. And for the first time, she looked like she believed him. The morning light seeped through the curtains in muted slants, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The house was quiet, quieter than Daniel had expected. He had barely slept, even though he had offered Trey the spare room. He had half expected her to be gone when he woke up. He wouldn't have blamed her. He was a stranger, a human, and the world had given her every reason to run. But as he stepped into the hallway, he could hear the faintest sound coming from the living room. Soft, rhythmic breaths, the quiet rustle of fabric. She was still here. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, his eyes settling on the couch. Trey was asleep, curled protectively around her child, her long, dark hair cascading over the blanket like an ink spill. Ravi was nestled against her chest, small fingers clutching at the fabric of her mother's borrowed shirt. Something about the sight made Daniel hesitate. He had seen Trey as many things over the last 24 hours, desperate, cautious, starving, but never at peace. Even now, in the safety of his home, there was a tension in her body, as if she was ready to wake up and fight at a moment's notice. He wasn't sure why, but it unsettled him. Daniel cleared his throat, just loud enough to make his presence known without startling her. Trey stirred instantly. Her golden eyes snapped open, alert and wary, scanning the room before they settled on him. A flicker of recognition softened her expression, but only slightly. "You stayed," he said, more as an observation than a question. Trey blinked, shifting carefully so she wouldn't wake Ravi. "I did." Her voice was still hoarse from exhaustion, but it held a quiet certainty. Daniel nodded, stepping into the kitchen. "You want coffee?" She hesitated. "I do not know what that is." That caught him off guard. He paused mid-reach for the pot, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Wait, seriously? You've never had coffee?" Trey lifted a brow. "Is that strange?" Daniel huffed a small laugh and shook his head. "Not really. Just means you've been missing out." She watched as he poured the dark liquid into 2 mugs, the steam curling in lazy ribbons. He slid one across the counter toward her. She hesitated before reaching for it, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic hesitantly, as if expecting it to burn. Daniel took a sip, nodding for her to do the same. Trey brought the cup to her lips, inhaling cautiously before taking a small sip. She stilled, her brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment, Daniel thought she was going to spit it out. Then she swallowed. "Bitter," she murmured. He smirked. "Yeah, it grows on you." Trey hummed, but said nothing more, cradling the cup between her hands as if it were more valuable for its warmth than its taste. The quiet stretched, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. Now that she was a little more settled, he could see things he hadn't noticed before. The faint scars along her arms, the sharp collarbones that hinted at months of malnourishment. The way she sat, straight-backed, poised, but with a subtle edge of restraint, as if even rest was something she didn't allow herself too often. He wasn't sure why, but it made something in his chest tighten. After a moment, he set his cup down. "You were a soldier, weren't you?" Trey went completely still. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't have to. The way her fingers tightened around the mug, the slight shift in her posture, he had hit a nerve. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "I was." Daniel nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. The Velmari had fought fiercely during the war, but most of them hadn't been given a choice. It had been survival for them, just like it had been for humanity. He hesitated before asking, "Did you lose someone?" Trey's gaze flickered, and for the first time, he saw something raw beneath the guarded exterior. "Everyone," she said simply. Daniel clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what answer he had expected, but the weight of that single word settled between them like a stone. He had known the war had been brutal. He had seen the aftermath in news reports, in the images of destroyed cities and mass graves on planets that no longer had names. But knowing something and hearing it, feeling the grief in the way someone spoke, were 2 different things. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Trey inhaled, as if about to respond, but before she could, Ravi stirred against her chest, letting out a soft whimper. Immediately, Trey's entire focus shifted. Her expression softened, her hand instinctively moving to stroke the baby's back in slow, soothing circles. Daniel watched as the child calmed, pressing herself closer to her mother's warmth. Trey exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Then, to his surprise, she looked back up at him. "You lost people too," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel hesitated, but then he nodded. Yeah, there were things he didn't talk about, names he didn't say aloud. But even if he had, he wasn't sure Trey would have recognized them. They had been enemies once. Now, they were just 2 people sitting at a kitchen table, haunted by the same ghosts. Trey studied him for a moment longer before she did something that caught him completely off guard. She reached across the table. It was a small movement, hesitant but unmistakable. Her fingertips barely brushed against the back of his hand, a fleeting contact, one she could have easily retracted if she had changed her mind. But she didn't. Daniel didn't move. He didn't pull away. He just let her touch linger, barely there, but significant in a way he couldn't quite explain. Velmari didn't touch humans. Not unless they had to, which meant this moment, this choice, was something more. Trey withdrew her hand as quickly as she had offered it, wrapping her fingers around her mug once more. But the air between them had changed. The walls weren't entirely gone, but they had cracked. And for the first time, Daniel wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just helping her. Maybe she was helping him too. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. Daniel had been out in the back alley, dumping a bag of trash into the bin, when he noticed it, the eerie stillness of the street. Normally, even in this part of the city, there was something to break the quiet. The distant hum of traffic, the muffled voices of neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, the occasional stray cat knocking over a garbage lid. But now there was nothing. Daniel frowned, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bin as a strange unease settled into his chest. Something felt off. Slowly, he turned back toward the house, his senses sharpening. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch, glancing toward the street. The shadows between the buildings stretched long and dark in the dim glow of the streetlights, but he didn't see anything. Still, the feeling didn't go away. He shook it off and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The warmth of the house was an immediate contrast to the frozen air outside, and for a brief moment, Daniel allowed himself to relax. He shrugged off his coat and ran a hand through his hair, listening to the faint sounds coming from the living room. Trey's quiet voice, speaking in soft Velmari syllables to Ravi. The baby cooed in response, and something in Daniel's chest tightened at the sound. They had been here for nearly a week now. In that short time, his house had transformed from a quiet, empty space to something almost resembling a home. It was a dangerous thought, one that he knew better than to indulge in. But then Trey would do something small, fold the blanket neatly after using it, hum an unfamiliar melody while rocking Ravi to sleep, and Daniel would find himself wondering how he had ever lived in such silence before. He stepped into the living room, leaning against the doorway. Trey sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling Ravi in her arms. The baby blinked up at her, tiny fingers reaching for the strands of dark hair that fell over her mother's shoulder. Trey's golden eyes softened as she gently brushed a hand over Ravi's forehead, whispering something in her native tongue. It was a small, intimate moment, one Daniel knew he had no right to intrude upon. Still, when Trey lifted her gaze and met his, she didn't look annoyed to see him there. If anything, there was something almost calm about her expression. "You're back," she murmured. Daniel smirked. "Didn't go far." She nodded, adjusting Ravi's blanket. "It's quieter than usual outside." Daniel's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't said anything about it, but she had noticed it too. That same unnatural stillness. "Yeah," he said. "I noticed." Trey studied him for a moment, then looked down at Ravi. The baby had already begun to drift off again, her small breaths even and warm against her mother's chest. Daniel hesitated before pushing off the doorway and stepping into the room. "You should get some rest too," he said. "You haven't been sleeping much." Trey exhaled slowly. "I don't sleep deeply," she admitted. "Not anymore." Daniel didn't press. He had seen the way she startled awake at the slightest noise, how she instinctively positioned herself between Ravi and the door, even in sleep. She had spent too long living in fear. He wasn't sure she even knew how to rest anymore. But before he could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. The sound was sharp, precise. Daniel's body went rigid. Across from him, Trey stiffened, her entire posture shifting from exhaustion to alertness in an instant. Ravi stirred against her, but Trey held her close, her golden eyes snapping toward the front of the house. Daniel moved first, stepping toward the door as casually as he could, though every muscle in his body was tense. He peered through the peephole. Two figures stood outside. Men. They weren't wearing uniforms, but that didn't mean anything. Their posture, the way they stood with their hands just barely out of sight, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a friendly visit. Daniel glanced back toward the living room. Take Ravi and go to the back room, he said quietly. Trey's grip on the baby tightened. Who is it? Don't know, but I don't want to take chances. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. She rose smoothly, cradling Ravi against her, and disappeared down the hall without another word. Only when he heard the quiet click of a door closing did Daniel turn back to the entrance. He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to step halfway into the frame, blocking the view inside. Can I help you? He asked, voice even. The man closest to him had short crop hair and a hard, weathered face. His companion was younger, thinner, but something about him felt twitchy, like he was waiting for an excuse to act. You, Carter? The older one asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. Who's asking? The younger man glanced toward the window. You got a guest staying with you? Daniel felt his jaw tighten. What? The older man exhaled through his nose. Look, I'll keep this simple. We know a Velmari woman's been seen in this neighborhood. A woman with a baby. Now, we're not saying you have her, but if you did, it'd be in your best interest to tell us. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. There was no good way to answer this. He knew exactly what happened to Velmari refugees when they were caught. Best case, they were deported, dumped on some overcrowded station where disease and starvation did the rest. Worst case, they were never seen again. He forced himself to give a dry chuckle. A Velmari? In this neighborhood? You think one of them would last 5 minutes around here? The younger man smirked. You'd be surprised what people are willing to risk. Daniel shrugged. Haven't seen anything. Now, unless you got a warrant, I'd appreciate it if you got off my porch. The older man narrowed his eyes, but after a beat, he nodded once. If you see anything, he said, voice laced with warning, you let us know. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched as they turned and walked back down the street. Only when they were out of sight did he let out a slow, steady breath. Then he locked the door and turned back toward the hallway. Trey was already there, standing in the shadows. He hadn't even heard her move. They will come back, she murmured. Daniel met her gaze. I know, she swallowed. If they find me, they will take Ravi. His fists clenched. He knew that too. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Daniel exhaled. They won't find you, he said. I won't let them. Trey's eyes widened slightly. Something flickered in her expression. Something Daniel couldn't quite name. But whatever it was, she believed him. And for now, that was enough. Daniel didn't sleep that night. After the men left, he had checked the locks twice, then positioned himself in the living room, close enough to hear if anyone came near the house. He had done his best to reassure Trey, but the truth was he wasn't sure what would happen next. They had been lucky this time. The two men hadn't pushed harder, hadn't forced their way inside. But Daniel knew that luck wouldn't hold out forever. They would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't be asking questions. Trey hadn't slept much either. She had stayed in the back room with Ravi, keeping the baby close, her body rigid with tension. He had seen the way she held Ravi tighter than usual, as if she expected someone to rip her child from her arms at any second. By morning, a decision had been made. We need to leave, Trey said. Daniel had expected it, but hearing the words still sent a sharp, unwanted pang through his chest. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Where? Trey hesitated. She looked down at Ravi, who was still asleep, her small fingers curled around a fold of her mother's shirt. I do not know, she admitted, but we cannot stay. Daniel leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. They'll be watching the roads, he said. The transport hubs, too. She nodded. There are places Velmari go. Safe places. If I can get to one of them, I will find help. Daniel studied her, his jaw tightening. And what happens if you don't? Trey didn't answer. That was the part she hadn't figured out yet. He rubbed at the back of his neck. If we run, we need a plan. You can't just disappear into the city and hope for the best. Trey shifted, adjusting Ravi in her arms. I did not expect you to come with us. Daniel froze. The way she said it, calm, matter of fact, made his stomach twist in a way he hadn't expected. She had already accepted that he wouldn't follow, that this was where their paths split. It shouldn't have bothered him. He had known, from the moment he let her in, that this wasn't permanent. That one day, she and Ravi would leave, and things would go back to how they were before. Quiet. Simple. But now, the thought of that silence felt wrong. Daniel exhaled through his nose. I didn't say I wouldn't go. Trey's head snapped up, her golden eyes widening slightly. Daniel, I'm not letting you do this alone. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. You don't know the city like I do. You don't know who to avoid, which streets are watched. You need someone who does. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she just looked at him, really looked at him. Daniel wasn't sure what she was searching for, but after a long moment, she let out a quiet breath. All right. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier, something unspoken. She had spent so long surviving alone that accepting help wasn't easy. But this time, she wouldn't fight it. They didn't have much time. Daniel grabbed an old backpack from his closet, stuffing it with essentials, food, water, extra clothes. He didn't have much in the way of weapons, just an old hunting knife and a battered revolver he hadn't fired in years. It would have to do. Trey worked quickly, too. She packed lightly, only taking what Ravi needed: blankets, a spare set of clothes, a small pouch filled with something Daniel didn't recognize. She moved with precision, her military training showing in the way she double-checked everything without wasting time. It wasn't until they were nearly ready to go that Daniel hesitated. Once they walked out that door, there was no coming back. His life, the quiet, predictable routine he had built, would be gone. He had spent years keeping his head down, staying out of trouble, making sure the war remained nothing more than a distant memory. And now, he was throwing it all away. For them. For her. He should have been scared. Instead, he felt alive. Trey stood near the door, Ravi tucked securely against her chest. She looked at him, waiting. Daniel took a slow breath. Then he nodded. Let's go. They moved through the city like shadows, keeping to the alleys, avoiding main roads. Daniel led the way, guiding them through the back streets he knew best, watching for patrols, for anyone who looked twice in their direction. Trey stayed close, her grip firm around Ravi, her golden eyes scanning every corner. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. Hours passed. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of the city. Trey paused, glancing back the way they came. The skyline stretched behind them, its lights flickering against the dark sky. This had been her prison for so long. Now, she was finally leaving it behind. Daniel studied her. Where to now? She hesitated. Then she met his gaze. There's a ship, she said. A transport. It leaves for the outer colonies in 2 days. If we can reach it, we'll reach it, Daniel said. Trey blinked, then nodded. They started walking again. The road ahead was uncertain. They had no guarantees, no safety net. But for the first time, they weren't running alone. They were running together. 2 days later, under the cover of night, a small cargo ship lifted off from a hidden launch site deep in the frozen countryside. Inside, a human man sat beside a Velmari woman. A sleeping child nestled between them. For the first time in a long time, neither of them had to look over their shoulder. They had escaped. The twin sons of Vera, 3 rows over rolling green hills, casting a golden glow across the small settlement that stretched along the river's edge. The planet was nothing like the frozen city they had left behind. Here, the air was warm, the sky a soft violet hue, and the scent of wildflowers drifted lazily on the breeze. It had been nearly 6 months since they arrived, and for the first time in years, they weren't running anymore. Daniel stood at the edge of a small wooden deck, staring out at the landscape that was slowly becoming home. The settlement was a mix of humans and Velmari, refugees, traders, settlers looking for a fresh start. There were no patrols, no wary glances in the streets, no doors slammed in Trey's face. Here, no one cared where you came from, only where you were going. Behind him, the sound of quiet laughter reached his ears. He turned, leaning against the railing, watching as Trey and Ravi sat on a blanket spread across the grass. Ravi had grown stronger since they arrived. She was no longer the frail, quiet infant Daniel had first held in his arms that night in the snow. Now, she was full of life, crawling, babbling, reaching for everything with her small hands. Trey sat cross-legged beside her, golden eyes soft with warmth as she let Ravi tug at a strand of her long, dark hair. The baby squealed happily, shaking her tiny fists, and Trey laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that Daniel still wasn't used to hearing. She was different here, lighter. She no longer carried the weight of survival on her shoulders, no longer flinched at every unfamiliar sound. The sharpness in her gaze had softened into something gentler, something hopeful. Daniel smiled to himself before pushing off the railing and making his way over. The moment Ravi saw him, her golden eyes lit up and she let out an excited chirp, a Velmari sound that Daniel had learned meant happiness. She reached for him instantly, small fingers grasping at the air. Daniel chuckled, scooping her up effortlessly. "You're getting heavy, kid," Ravi babbled in response, pressing her face against his chest, her tiny hands grabbing at his shirt. Trey watched them, her smile lingering. "She likes you." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, well, I am pretty likable." Trey rolled her eyes, but there was amusement in her gaze. Daniel adjusted Ravi in his arms, watching as the baby reached up, touching his face with curious fingers. "You think she'll remember any of it?" he asked. Trey's smile dimmed slightly. The cold? The fear? She shook her head. No, she was too young. Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Good." Trey shifted closer, resting a hand on Ravi's back as the baby curled against him. "She will only remember this." Daniel looked at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, at the way her golden eyes shone with something softer than before. She wasn't just talking about Ravi. This was her life now. Not running, not hiding, just living. Daniel reached for Trey's hand, threading his fingers through hers. She squeezed back without hesitation. They had found home, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt like theirs to shape. The wind carried the scent of the wildflowers through the air as the twin suns continued to rise, painting the sky with light. A new dawn, a new beginning.